Vladimir Putin domestically does have critics who see him as overly cautious, as overly defensively minded, who would very much like much broader campaign of destruction waged against Ukraine, but also more broadly internationally, since 2022 or arguably before. Now, Putin is quite worried and has been worried for a while that he looks weak in the eyes of such people because that might mean he could lose some support from what you might call the nationalist front within Russia. And of course, any time any part of Russian prestige is hurt, any time there's military damage to Russia, significant military damage, like with the Kerch Bridge, like with the drone attacks and so on, then that damages Putin.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Dr Rasmus Nielssen from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. He's also author of the book Uncanny Allies, Russia and Belarus on the Edge. Dr Nielssen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, over the weekend, we saw Ukraine attack and destroy dozens of these Russian strategic and nuclear bombers. How crucial have these strategic weapons been for Russia in projecting power on the world stage?
Yeah, I really like your choice of word there because it's not simply a matter of their immediate military capabilities, it's also a matter of exactly the image they're projecting abroad and at home. So central to Russian self-understanding as promoted under Vladimir Putin in particular, bit under Yeltsin as well before him, but certainly under Putin, is this idea of Russia as a great power. For that, of course, you need to be able to project power, not only within Eurasia, but arguably, globally. And when some of your most central armory is this vulnerable, even very, very far from the borders of the battlefield, so almost towards the borders of China, as far as we can see, then that shows a level of vulnerability, a level of creakiness, if you like, that simply doesn't work with the great power image.
And how worrying is it to have irreplaceable strategic weapons destroyed like this in terms of Russia's nuclear deterrent? I mean, does it unbalance Russia's deterrent against other nations like the USA?
Well, again, I think we have to distinguish between the military aspect and and if you like, the brand aspect. So militarily speaking, if it came, which it won't, but if it came to sort of a third world war situation with open warfare, then Russia still has its nuclear deterrent. That's not gone away. But that's not really what anybody is expecting in Russia or elsewhere, even if you sometimes have more or less intelligent talking heads in Russia talking that way. Where it does matter, however, is that you need to be able to show from the Russian side that you can react anywhere to anything that is seen as a threat. The whole point is you have to be able, as Russia, to define the threat and say, we want to take this seriously. This is what Russia believes, sometimes correctly, sometimes not, that America has been able to do over the decades. And this is where Russia wants to see itself. Now, when all of a sudden the equipment, the airplanes and other equipment you need to do that, when all of a sudden that's taken out by a supposedly much weaker enemy, then you've got a problem. I mean, here we got to remember, Louis, that this is done by the Ukrainians and at least to some extent done through relatively low-tech means from what we can see. That simply doesn't work for Russia. If it had been done, say, by NATO or someone directly, funded by and controlled by NATO as Russia, the Russian state is want to say Ukraine is being, if it had been done by someone with high-tech capabilities, a real great power in Russia's parlance, then you can just about sort of say, okay, it's a temporary setback from Russia's point of view, but this is what we expect when we're playing with the big boys. When we're playing with someone like Ukraine, that from a Russian point of view isn't really a real country, then it just doesn't work. And it puts Russia down at the level of Ukraine. And from the Russian point of view, that's simply unacceptable domestically and in terms of international image.
And these, what have been termed hybrid warfare attacks are continuing even just hours before we're speaking now. The Ukrainians have blown up a stanchion on the Kerch Bridge. There is a strategic use for that bridge, certainly, a defensive use as well, but it's more of an ego piece for Putin as well, isn't it? How's he going to feel about that bridge being attacked again?
Oh, he's going to feel absolutely terrible, and he's probably also going to feel at least some level of concern about how this will affect him domestically. And here I should stress I'm not talking about people rising from the streets, but I am talking about Russian elites. Look, in any kind of warfare, of course, logistics are very important, and you're absolutely right, of course, Louis, to start by emphasizing it does have a military purpose. The Ukrainians aren't simply out to annoy Putin. Having said that, the Kerch Bridge was presented there, in the aftermath of 2014 as well, to show that Russia is, physically gathering its land, so to speak. It is sort of dragging in whatever part of the world it believes it should own. And whenever then again we have someone, ostensibly not at the Russian level, going out and stopping this and saying, no, no, we can cut off these bits of what you call Russia whenever we want to, or at least when you're least expecting it, then that shows Putin as vulnerable. Here we also got to remember, Louis, that although we, of course, in the West, and I think quite rightly, see him as a warmonger, and I would argue he's been a warmonger from the day he became president, 2.5 decades ago. Vladimir Putin domestically does have critics who see him as overly cautious, as overly defensively minded, who would very much like much broader campaign of destruction waged against Ukraine, but also more broadly internationally, since 2022 or arguably before. Now, Putin is quite worried and has been worried for a while that he looks weak in the eyes of such people, because that might mean he could lose some support from what you might call the nationalist front within Russia. And of course, any time any part of Russian prestige is hurt, any time there's military damage to Russia, significant military damage, like with the Kerch Bridge, like with the drone attacks and so on, then that damages Putin in this. Yeah, it damages Putin's brand in this situation.
Well, elsewhere, peace talks, of course, have continued yesterday in Turkey. How would you judge the progress of those talks, if there's been any, really?
I would judge it as predictable. I did not expect much to happen, as we know from several sources now, including the Ukrainians, to some extent the Russians as well. The Russians turned up with maximalist demands as they've done before. It becomes a performance piece. You know, you can see a lot of international actors using performance pieces instead of real politics these years. I mean, the Americans are doing it as well to a large extent. The Russians were doing it here to try and show that they definitely have not lost and they definitely do not need to compromise, so on and so forth. You could be very charitable and very optimistic, perhaps, and say that the fact the Russians are willing to sit down, in front of the public glare and talk to the Ukrainians directly is some level, brings some level of hope. Again, though, this is done very technocratically. This is done again as performance piece. Putin is not going to turn up to any of these talks for all I can see. Um, and it does look a bit as if the Russians are perhaps trying to push things along, hoping for some breakthroughs on the battlefield, hoping that the Americans might be persuaded to be even more charitable to Russians. I mean, you've seen rhetoric coming out in recent days from the Americans, again talking about how, for instance, Russian fears of NATO enlargement is reasonable and things like that. So the Russians might still, from all I can see, they're still trying to sort of push this along to see if they can get more diplomatic, at least maybe even economic benefits from the Americans. That seems to be what they're doing right now.
And Russia again put forward those maximalist demands, as you said, for Ukraine to demilitarize, recognize swathes of occupied and unoccupied land as Russian, and drop any sort of allegiance or support from the West. How does this reflect Putin's wider objectives over Ukraine and, in a sense, over a lot of former Soviet territory?
So we've got to understand Putin's tactics here, if you like, his strategy, probably more correctly, in three ways. We've got to look at it. I've hinted at this already, Louis, but domestically, in terms of domestic branding, and arguably domestic security, in terms of international branding, and in terms of the military sort of effort on the battlefield. In terms of, if we start with the military effort, because that's the easiest bit to go with, really, the Russians are trying to basically exhaust Ukraine. Now, when you have Ukrainian successful bombings in Russia, that obviously doesn't seem, that plan doesn't seem to be going very well from the Russian point of view. But they are still to some extent believing, the Russians, that they have large reserves still, both in terms of manpower, in terms of, equipment and so on. So they have some belief that if the Europeans and the Americans, but also the Europeans, could sort of be cut off from assisting the Ukrainians to the extent necessary, then maybe over years, over a year, maybe several years, you can start seeing the Ukrainian ability to resist Russia, at least in the areas which Russia has so far occupied or partially occupied. Maybe that can be achieved. So that's the military side. In terms of the international side, now, as we can both see, and as your listeners will be able to see as well, Russia is in absolutely no state to go out and sort of conquer all of the post-Soviet region. That's not going to happen. And even the more delusional elements of Putin's entourage don't really believe they can do that militarily. However, if they can show that they will not give up, that if it comes to a conflict, they will start carpet bombing civilians and cause immense suffering to a lot of post-Soviet countries that are less capable than the Ukrainians, in terms of societal cohesiveness, in terms of military capability, so on. If the Russians can show that, then maybe they can convince other post-Soviet states not to go too far away, not to start betting on the West, maybe not even to bet on China, but actually, find an accommodation with Russia. So that could be an indirect message to be sent there. And then, of course, also there's the broader international image, both in terms of, relations with the West, but also in terms of relations, say, with China. I mean, don't forget, Louis, there are plenty of people in the Russian elites now who are quite concerned about becoming overly dependent on China, overly dependent, almost becoming an appendix to a growing China. And that's not a military fear as much as it's a matter of, self-image as well, if you like, ontological security. We have to be, rulers of our own roost at least. And if they can sort of drag this on and show, we can handle our own affairs, at least we will not give up, then that's sending a signal to China too. And if I can just add one little aspect as well, and maybe we can continue talking about that if you wish. But don't forget also, Louis, that although this war is terrible for Russia in so many ways, it is not necessarily terrible for individual Russians. There are people in the Russian elite, and here we can talk about Putin and his sort of creation of himself as a warmonger, as a war leader, but also lots of people within the Russian elite who are earning good money on this war and who do not really particularly care about Russians dying on the battlefield as long as they can keep building up their position in the Russian military-industrial complex. Now, those people might also have an interest in this war dragging on for months and years. And of course, what's happening now could help them see that fulfilled, if you like.
Yeah, well, that is exactly what I want to come over now, because while the rest of Europe is kind of just waking up to the idea of remilitarization in the 21st century, for Russia, it's been a much longer term project, hasn't it? I mean, how did Putin rebuild the Russian military after the collapse of the Soviet Union? And how crucial has that been to his regime, not just physically and militarily, but for his image as well?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the angle to take. I mean, how does one rebuild a military? Of course, there's a practical side to it, but there's also very much a symbolic, a moral side to it. What sort of state do we want to be? So if we go all the way back to when Putin comes in, short stint as prime minister, and then he becomes president back in around the turn of the millennium, Putin comes in on the basis of war. Now, it may be a war domestically, as in the fight in Chechnya, the Second Chechen War, but it is very much a war, and it is seen as such within Russia. It is seen as something that is essential for Russia's survival as the Russia that it should be, both in terms of fighting terrorism, but also in terms of fighting the potential breakup of Russia. Now, back 2.5 decades ago, of course, as you and I will know, as many of your listeners will remember, internationally there wasn't that much of a focus on Putin's and the Russians' carpet bombing of Chechen cities. Yes, there was some focus, and there were some notable people who spoke up about it, but mostly people in the West, and this goes for Europe as well as North America, were just happy to have someone in-house whom we could do business with, to go a bit further back with my quote. Someone who was, sober and reasonably straightforward. That was how he was being seen. But from the very beginning, in late 1999 and then into 2000, Vladimir Putin presents himself as someone who will stop at nothing and stop at no human sacrifice in order to rebuild Russia's greatness. Then you have about 8 years or so the first two presidential terms of Vladimir Putin, where he's mostly presenting himself as a businessman, internationally speaking. But look at what's happening domestically in Russia. He's very much there, Putin is, building up the security apparatus, if you like, the so-called Siloviki, building up this idea of Russia as a security state that is ready to do unspeakable things to so-called terrorists, using various swear words very calculatedly. I'm not going to do that here, but I'm sure you and your readers will know them. And that sort of, calculated crudity, if you like, is part of it as well. We're not playing games anymore, we Russians. We are here to be, to create a secure state. Notice very carefully, a secure state, not a secure population. First and foremost, a secure state. Now, what is he doing practically at the same time? He's trying, to be fair, to root out of some of the corruption within the military services, or at least the corruption that he can't control. He's also trying gradually, and this also continues when Dmitry Medvedev comes in between 2008 and 2012 as president. Putin is, of course, still largely in charge, although now he's officially prime minister. And he's now trying to reduce the size of the Russian military and target it, bringing in more professional soldiers, more targeted corps that can go out and be inserted inside Russia, but also outside Russia. For instance, as we later see, say, in Syria and the Middle East more broadly, in Africa arguably as well, and indeed in parts of the Ukraine conflict from 2014 onwards. So he's trying in that sense to professionalize, but also still keep the Russian military centralized. Yeah. He's also trying, and this becomes really visible, Louis, when we get to 2012 onwards, when Putin comes back in power. He's also trying to militarize not just the Russian state, but the thinking within the Russian state. Now, when I've been doing research, when I've been writing, I try to focus on this as well, and many other scholars have done so too, but I think it's worth repeating here. Putin from 2012 onwards is trying to get the Russian population used to the fact that Russia is a war state, that Russia should be on a militarized footing, and that goes all the way down through the generations. So, for instance, particularly after 2014 with the invasion of Ukraine, but even from 2012 onwards, you start seeing a change in history writing, official history writing in Russia, talking much more favorably about Russia as the heir to the Second World War, heir to the triumphs of Stalingrad, Leningrad, so on and so forth. You start seeing children being militarized, and it's not just from the state, it's also from entrepreneurs, so-called in Russia, starting to sell military uniforms to small children, for instance. You start seeing the ads. You start hearing about how it's good to sacrifice yourself for the motherland. You start seeing the March of the Immortals, this yearly, or sometimes several times a year, march coming out, remembering people who died and relatives who died in the Second World War. You start seeing that becoming not a sad remembrance, but actually a glorification of their sacrifice. And therefore, more and more you see the image being projected that Russians, the ordinary Russian, is there to serve the state, particularly in a military framework. And of course, Louis, we see this in the Ukraine conflict now and the way that's being sold. But can I also take you back to when we had, do you remember, I'm sure you do and many of your readers do, but do you remember the terrorist attack on the Crocus concert center last year, which was obviously terrible, and I do feel absolutely with the poor civilians who got killed there. I've got no sympathy for that whatsoever, and I don't think any right-thinking person could have. But look then what happens when you have the terrorists, so-called, captured. Now, we can have a slight discussion about whether the people who were caught did carry out the attack or whether they all did so. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that they did. I am, as things stand, still willing to accept that. However, look at the treatment that's meted out to them. Look at the barbarism that is very calculatedly shown, both in terms of when they're caught and some of the footage coming out from the Russian special forces. Look also at the court trials, at least what we were allowed to see. That shows a level of violence. Again, a level of militarized crudity that is not a society losing or a state losing its head. that is very calculatedly shown to show, this is what we can do as the state if you go against us. And again, I have to stress, I am in no way sympathizing with what these people had done. And obviously, in any country, the punishment for that sort of attack would have to be severe. But when you start mutilating people, you might start wondering what message it's trying to be sent. And again, if you're looking at the war crimes without any comparison otherwise, because obviously the Ukrainian state is not carrying out terrorist attack, it's defending itself against unlawful criminal attacks. But if you're looking at the attacks carried out on Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian soldiers by Russia, and even broadcast by part of the Russian state, then I think we're in the same ballpark. I'm afraid. This idea that, the violence, the criminality is not emotive, it is not coincidental, it is calculated. And that's the sort of Russian state that has been built up. Now, please let me just add to this. I'm not thereby saying every Russian citizen likes this. Every Russian citizen is a criminal. Absolutely not. They're very brave, very good Russians. But we have to talk here, Louis, in a centralized Russian state about what the state stands for. And I'm afraid there I can only go with the evidence, and that evidence is grim indeed.
What is the state then of the Russian military and militarized Russia today then? I mean, we know at the core of Putin's war economy at the moment, there's this drive to get recruits in and avoid kind of a conscription, mobilization culture in Russia. Although we are at the same time hearing there's many regions that are cutting some of those very lucrative sign-up bonuses for these military volunteers. I mean, is there a sign now that this powerful military that Putin built up under Russia is now under strain? Or is this just the next step in restoring Russia, in Putin's mind, as one of the great military powers?
Well, I think, to give a brief answer, it's making do with what you've got, effectively. I mean, it's also a matter of what do we mean with power. If we're talking about a military that can simply throw in, as they say, people into the meat grinder, throw them to the front line, Russia still has plenty of people they can throw in there. Now, some of those people might rebel, which is why, of course, the Russian state has tried to be careful and getting people from the ethnic minorities, some ethnic minorities in particular, and getting them from outside the bigger cities, so there's less sort of relatives with connections who can complain about it. But Russia still has quite a bit of manpower. And although, yes, you are hearing grumblings in the Russian population about widespread conscription, I don't see that as coming to a crisis point just yet. So I think Russia has a bit to give off still there. Obviously, Russia still has significant logistical capabilities, and it still has plenty of destructive capability. I mean, it still has lots of missiles, for instance, lots of rockets, and it has no problem targeting civilian areas, as we know in Ukraine. So it can keep going for a long time. And if I can go back to something you said earlier, just to tie that in, you were hinting about this militarization, this military footing in parts of the West, not least in Europe. I think we have to, Louis, despite the fact that Russia is showing quite a bit of weakness, socioeconomic and arguably military as well, we have to be ready for this to be in the long run. Yeah, when I gave you that long sweep of recent history before to try and show how Russia got to this place, it also means, and you've hinted at this already, Russia is not going to change anytime soon. Let's say Putin died tomorrow. He's an elderly man. It could happen one way or the other. Russia isn't going to change straightforwardly. And Russia can certainly keep being a threat for the next 5-10 years, no problem, to Ukraine and elsewhere, even if hypothetically we had an armistice today, which we won't have, but if we did, we'd still have that problem. Russia can keep doing this. Does that make Russia a powerful country? I don't think so. I think part of being powerful requires you to have a significant socioeconomic base, and Russia is losing that quite quickly. That started before 2022, and the war, the full-scale invasion now, has certainly not made it better.
Well, Dr. Rasmus Nielssen, it sounds like there is a lot more to be discussed and a lot more developments due on Putin and the Russian military. And I'm sure we'll discuss those again in another episode. But thank you very much, Dr. Rasmus Nielssen from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London for joining me today on the Putin Files.
Thank you.